My wife was watching a TikTok video at the kitchen table. I poured myself a cup of coffee and joined her. I wasn't paying too much attention, but something in the back of my mind itched. Something was wrong. I looked up from my coffee and scratched my beard. "What's that you're watching?" I asked. "Lauren's bachelorette party," she said. "It was this weekend. I forgot." "What are they doing?" She handed over the phone. I saw these young women walking down an old road. They were singing and tearing at their dresses, messing up their perfectly sculpted hair. Then at the edge of the clip, you see a man by the side of the road. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't stop my hand from shaking. I hadn't felt that in a while. A second part. They're standing with the man. The video is blurry. They're singing with him, celebrating. Together they lean into the camera, yelling at the top of their lungs. "There go young men down the patter trail, down the patter trail, down the pattering trail. There go young men down the patter trail, and one ain't coming back." They were laying on the accent thick, dancing a little, swaying side to side drunkenly, wrapping their arms around the strange man. They sing the tune again, and by the end of the video, I hear a casual remark. "I enjoy the company," the man said. "Not so much your fellows." The camera pans. There's an ice spreading in the pit of my stomach, turning the coffee sour and heavy. The camera stops on a face that I hadn't seen for almost 20 years. I put the phone down, walked over to the kitchen sink, and threw up. I don't remember curling up on the floor, bawling my eyes out like a wailing child, but I did. I had a panic attack, my first in over a decade. I ought to give some context. I'm not the kind of man to break down for nothing. But if you'd been where I'd been, you'd do the same. Many years ago, I lived in a small town west of Waco. If you reach Meridian, you've gone too far. I was blessed with a lot of friends growing up. There was Norman, the quiet kid. Gerald was from a religious home. And Tom, well, he was just happy to be there. We'd been four peas in a pod since kindergarten, watching the same shows, playing the same games. Despite all that would happen, I'll never stop counting that blessing. So many folks never get to have what we had, an honest-to-God bond. When we got to high school, things started to change. Not a lot, but in big ways. Norman wasn't so quiet no more. Gerald got deep into history and social studies. And Tom, I suppose, was still just happy to be there. We were still the best of friends. Some would consider us brothers. We were closer than most of our families, for better or worse. But our plans were pulling us apart. That's just the way things happen sometimes. We knew that after high school, we were all heading our separate ways. Norman was joining the Army. Gerald was going to law school. I was going to get a degree in electrical engineering. Tom was sticking around to take over his old man's convenience store. The gang was splitting up for the first time ever, and no matter how jaded our teenage boy hearts were, we knew deep down that things wouldn't be the same. But we weren't going to say any goodbyes without getting outrageously drunk. It was a beautiful summer. The same old birds singing the same old songs, the dry grass coming alive under the sinking sun. We knew we were going to get eaten alive by mosquitoes, but we didn't care. Norman's older brother got us 2 bottles of vodka and a couple of 6-packs. Gerald dug out his old Nintendo 64. We hadn't touched that thing since we were kids. I mean, we still were, but we weren't old enough to notice. All we had were Kiss albums. We blasted them on repeat. We were playing GoldenEye and arguing whether Psycho Circus was the shittiest Kiss album or not. Tom was off in the corner keeping the music going, drunker than a short man doing a handstand in a wine barrel. We took shots, sang, and played until we didn't know who we were. We decided to take a walk back to my place to get some beef jerky. Somewhere along the road, we took a wrong turn. Now I've gone down that road 1,000 times, and I can swear on every fiber of my being that there is no possible way for a man to get lost along that road. But somehow, by some unholy intervention, we did. I remember Norman tripping over his feet and we having to pull him out of a ditch. Looking up, the road wasn't straight anymore. It curved around a bend, tipping downwards into a dark patch covered by desert willows. The asphalt gave way to a padded-down dirt trail. I figured we'd taken a wrong turn somewhere, but I couldn't make out where. I actually laughed. I'd never been so drunk that I'd taken a wrong turn off a straight road before. Coming around the bend, we noticed this rickety wooden house. You could barely see it in the shade. It was old, like something out of a western. As light trickled in through the canopy, we saw a bison skull hanging over the front door, and beneath it was an old man, eyeing us curiously from a distance. I think I was the only one who noticed him at first. The others were heading straight down the path. I stopped for a moment, meeting the old man's gaze. He had an old-fashioned black duster on, with a high collar going all the way up to his chin, stripy white hair running down his shoulders. I figured he was just some old man, living his best life. I didn't want to bother him. We'd keep going and we'd find our way back sooner or later. But Norman caught me looking and held up an arm. "Excuse me," he called out. "You know where we at?" The old man got up from his rocking chair and smiled at us, resting his hands on his hips. "You going down the patter trail," he said. "Ain't you old enough to read?" We looked at one another. No one had heard of it, and we'd lived there our whole lives. "We'll be on our way, sir," I said. "Thank you kindly." "No, you ain't." Before we could say anything, I heard a click. The old man was holding a revolver, an impeccable six-shooter. I could see the gleam all the way from the road. He had a steady hand and a steadier eye. He didn't blink, and his tired smile never faded. "How about you young gentlemen step right up, and I'll teach you something." We had to prop up Tom. He could barely stay on his feet. The old man wasn't taking no for an answer. I barely understood what was going on and figured he was just some cranky loner on a power trip. I'd met his kind before. I didn't take my eyes off the gun, but you gotta remember, the gun is just a tool. What you really ought to keep your eyes on is the man. "Stomp your foot," he said, pointing the gun at Gerald. "Stomp. Go on." Gerald did as he was told, stomping on the wooden deck until he found a rhythm. Then the old man turned to me. "You, clap." I clapped. Norman and Tom couldn't contribute. That they were even conscious to begin with was nothing short of a miracle. The old man started humming a tune. "There go young men down the patter trail," he sang. "Down the patter trail, down the patter trail." He pointed his gun at us. With every syllable, it bobbed to another person. "There go young men down the pattering trail." Norman, me, Tom, Gerald, and one done lost. His mind. Gerald, Norman. Click. Norman dove for cover, leaving Tom face down on the wooden deck. We all collapsed away from one another, scrambling for shelter, all except Tom, who was too drunk to get back up. We ran. Norman headed into the desert willows. I headed straight into the field. Gerald went down the road. It's one of those moments where you can't think straight, and every should and ought to runs out the back of your head. You don't think, you just do. He was armed and we weren't. We didn't stand a chance. "I ain't no bad man," he laughed. "I ain't evil, no children, no women." I looked back from a distance. I could see him dragging Tom by the hair like a trophy hunt. Tom swatted at his hand, but it was useless. The old man kept yelling into the night. "When a young man pitter-patters down my trail, I'll make sure he done lose his mind." He raised his revolver again, resting it against Tom's temple. He pulled the trigger, sending the songbirds fleeing into the sky. Dread settled in my gut, sending a burning ice into my veins. It was the moment I realized that behind all the rules and courtesies we've painted our lives with, there's nothing but promises to keep a man from shooting you in the head. "Look," he laughed. "He done lost his mind, son. He done lost his mind." I stumbled my way into the night, praying I'd find a familiar road before the next gunshot went off. I could hear singing in the distance, growing fainter. And when the sun finally rose, an eternity later, I was blacked out by the side of the road. My eyes red with tears and my tongue as dry as sand. Everyone was out looking for Tom the next day. But there was no such thing as the patter trail, and no one had heard about an old house with a bison skull. There were search parties, interviews, posters plastered all over town, but it got us nowhere. Tom's parents pleaded to the newspapers. Others blamed the three of us. The police thought we'd done something stupid and decided to blame it on a made-up boogeyman. I was interrogated 4 separate times, telling the same story over and over. At every turn we were attacked, questioned, and disbelieved. Even our own family started looking at us differently. There were the late-night talks. "I'll love you no matter what," my mom would whisper as she touched my hair. "I just need you to be honest with me." She meant well, but she didn't understand. I'd never told her a lie, and she couldn't believe it. Norman kept true to his word and joined the army. Gerald moved away to study law. I moved even further away. Every time we got together, people were giving us this look, like they tried to see right through us, not knowing there was nothing to see. But that didn't stop them from trying. It had all turned into this infested rumor that we couldn't get away from. There were no more good mornings from the neighbors. No "have a nice day" from the cashier. At best, we got nods and frowns. So there was nothing left to keep us around, not even each other. So we went our separate ways, hoping to leave it all behind. That morning by the kitchen table, when I heard that chant, it all came back to me. 20 years in the making. The desert willows, the dirt road, and that all too familiar tune. But Lauren and her bachelorettes hadn't gone missing. They were fine, if a bit hungover. But the man in the picture wasn't old, and he wasn't pointing a gun at anybody. It was Tom, not a day older than we last saw him. When I calmed down, I looked up Norman and Gerald. I hadn't talked to them in years. It took some time to even find them, and Gerald had set his socials to private. But by a friend of a friend, a bit of luck, and stubbornly refusing to back off, I managed to send them both a link to the video. After that, things went quiet. I would stay by the computer, pressing update in my browser, but nothing would happen. A part of me was relieved. Maybe they'd moved on. Maybe I was the problem. But it didn't last. Late one night, I got a call from an unknown number. But I answered, and I'd recognize Norman's voice any day, at any time. "Jesus Christ," he sighed. "It's impossible." "You know it ain't," I said. There was a long pause as he deflated on the other side. I could hear ice clinking in a glass. "Yeah, I know." Norman was married, had 2 kids. He'd been deployed overseas and brought back a changed perspective. Gerald, on the other hand, was practicing law upstate, living on his own. He'd left the church the moment he got away from his family. We all got together in a chat. I wanted us to catch up, but it was harder than expected. We didn't have a lot in common anymore. Norman and Gerald were opposites on the political spectrum, and our lives looked very different. But no matter how fast our small talk died, the real issue remained. The patter trail was out there. Despite what everyone had told us, that night it happened. We couldn't figure out how Tom could be in that video. It didn't make any sense. We'd seen what happened to him, and those of us who hadn't seen it had, at the very least, heard it. We've told different stories over the years. It's easy for people to understand murder, so that's usually all I've said. It's harder to understand the patter trail. Hell, none of us really understood it. On paper, it didn't make sense. Lauren and her bachelorettes had been celebrating somewhere up near Amarillo, while we used to live near Waco. There was no way for our 2 groups to stumble on the same trail that far apart. We had a group chat and kept coming back to the same issue over and over again. "I think we gotta face the facts," said Norman, "that whatever this is, it's not normal." "It's one thing for something not to be normal," said Gerald, "and another thing entirely to be supernatural." "No one's suggesting that," I added. "He could have moved." "And stayed the same for 20 years?" Norman asked. "I'm not buying it." "Do we even know that's Tom?" Gerald asked. "Are we sure about that?" But we were sure. We'd never stop seeing his face in our nightmares. I could pick his voice out in a crowd of thousands. There was no doubt in my mind, and I could tell the others felt the same. We might have turned into very different people, with very different lives, but we couldn't change what we knew to be true. "I think we need to meet up," I said. "We need to do something." It took some time to arrange. Norman's wife wasn't keen on him leaving her alone with the kids. He told her about having seen one of his best friends get shot when he was younger, but how that translated into him having to leave 20 years later didn't sound right. He had a family to care for. He couldn't be out chasing murderers. But Norman couldn't help it. I think he blamed himself for leaving Tom behind all those years ago. Gerald, on the other hand, had little holding him back. Not even a cat to feed. But he'd painted himself this perfectly balanced life where everything had a note on his calendar and everything was perfectly predictable. He had new friends in a new town, and they expected him to be places. It must have been painful for him, making space for old grudges in his sparkling new calendar app. I had to tell my wife about this. She wanted to go with me, but I couldn't let her. I'd lost Tom all those years ago, and I never recovered. Losing her would end me. She knew about my past and having lost a friend of mine. We'd talked about it, but I'd never told her about the patter trail. How could I? Fine, she said, but if I can't come, you got to do one thing for me. We'd been arguing for hours. We were tired, both physically and emotionally. She wandered off to the basement and returned with a gun. She put it down on the table. I didn't even know we had one. You have to take this, she said. If you're going anywhere near a killer, even with the police just minutes away, you're taking this, and you're calling me every day. It was non-negotiable. Bless her heart. I met Norman and Gerald in Waco for the first time in decades. It was only a fast stop, but we had dinner together before headed west. Gerald talked about civil law. Norman talked about immigration. Gerald ordered a vegetarian dish. Norman had the veal. I settled for the fish and kept my mouth shut. We made our way west in separate cars. We followed the same roads, took the same exits, and drove past the same gas station. After a while, the roads started to look familiar. Muscle memory kicked in, and before we knew it, we were looking down a street where we'd played as kids. Norman's brother still lived in town, so we had a place to stay. We parked, small talked for a little bit, and retreated to the garage. Once the doors were closed, we sat down on some cheap, sun-tanned plastic garden furniture. There was a wobbly white plastic table with a jar of cigarette butts. Norman had already lit a cigarette, and Gerald was visibly annoyed, fake coughing out some passive aggression. We heard Norman's brother wish us a good night from the other room as he wandered off, and the conversation settled. "There's no point in wandering around," said Norman. "We've combed through every inch of this place over and over. There's no patter trail." "Agreed," said Gerald. "We couldn't have walked more than an hour or two at most. It's impossible." "So we all agree to that?" I asked. "That we're dealing with something impossible?" Norman snuffed out his cigarette and nodded. "Sure. When dealing with something impossible, you can't expect things to make sense based on rational thought. The gloves are off. There are new rules, and you gotta make do with what you got." Norman had a shotgun and a box of buckshot. Gerald was a pacifist and refused to carry a weapon. I ended up somewhere in the middle with the handgun my wife gave me. Of course, if this was really Tom, we'd have no need for any kind of weapon in the first place, but I refused to go unprepared. Norman agreed. We discussed what we ought to do. Gerald suggested firing up the old game console, hoping that might be the trigger. I suggested putting on Kiss albums. Norman, on the other hand, dug out his brother's tequila stash. Things didn't really pan out the way they did back when we were teenagers. Gerald was careful with his drinking. Norman was too busy telling stories from his deployment. I kept nodding off. Alcohol makes me sleepy nowadays. So sure, we got tipsy, and it was nice to catch up, but we got nowhere near the patter trail. Somewhere around 2 a.m., we decided to wander a bit. I kept yawning, and Norman had turned from happy drunk to angry drunk. Gerald had hit a quasi-intellectual, better-than-thou kind of drunk. We didn't get to the end of the street before the two of them were at each other's throats, yelling at one another to the point where they woke up the neighbor's dog. There was some pushing, some accusations. Norman threw around the word spineless a lot. Gerald settled for idiot. I just asked them to shut the hell up. We didn't get very far that night. I ended up sleeping in my car. Norman curled up in a sleeping bag on the garage floor. Gerald went inside the house and crashed on the couch. The next day we were hungover, disheartened and annoyed, mostly with each other, but with ourselves as well. I think we all considered ourselves idiots to even be there to begin with. We'd been roped in by some idea that we could settle a score from decades ago, like we were some kind of action heroes. After a long and quiet breakfast, we ended up at the same weathered table out in the garage. Norman broke the silence. "I think about it a lot," he said. "I know y'all blame me for dropping Tom. That's on me." "No one's blaming you, damn it," said Gerald. "Never did. The man had a gun on you." "I held him," Norman continued. "He trusted me, and I dropped him." "It was that or getting shot," I said. "You ain't had no choice." Norman shook his head. Gerald put a hand on his shoulder. I could hear a crack in Norman's voice as he closed his eyes. "I could have done something," he muttered. "I could have." We spent the day going around town, seeing some acquaintances. We checked out our childhood homes. Mine had been sold years ago. Gerald's had been abandoned. We walked by our old school, checking out our hangout spots. Some of the marks we'd made were still there. An N+R carved into a wooden beam from when Norman had a crush on Ramona. A spray-painted Gerald is King from when he won our Mario Kart tournament. And there on the edge of the bench where we used to read comics was the most painful text of all. Tom was here. We figured we'd give it another shot. Even if we couldn't make sense of it, we could at least get wasted. So that night, Gerald put away his glasses. I put on Psycho Circus, and Norman put his hair up with a fancy red tie. We raised our glasses to Tom over and over. We sang. We complained. And in a way, we even found things to agree on. Somewhere around the fourth shot, the lines in the sand started to get a bit blurry. This was feeling less like a rescue and more like a farewell party. Somewhere around the sixth shot, Norman and I started talking about our wives, and Gerald took the opportunity to go outside for a piss. By the sixth shot, we realized he hadn't come back. We had another shot and got our guns. Norman had taken a few too many and kept wobbling back and forth. Now, I don't trust a drunk with a gun, but I trusted Norman. The only thing steady with him was his aim. We walked around looking for Gerald. We couldn't find him. Norman shook his head. "We can't look for him," he said. "That don't work. We just gotta go." "Go where?" "Just go." With a bottle each, we pointed in a random direction and just started walking. Somewhere along the path, we started humming that tune. It was still there, buried in the back of our minds. There go young men down the patter trail. We might not be that young anymore, but we were heading down that same trail nonetheless. Singing it took away its power, made it feel real. It was us challenging something we didn't understand, and we bellowed out the words in a whiskey-tinted scream. And before long, we heard Gerald in the distance, joining in the song. We didn't even notice the path turning into patted down dirt. There were no houses behind us. We could see the road bending downward into a thicket of desert willows ahead. Gerald waved at us from further down the road, stumbling over his own feet. He came up to us, his speech slurred. "There's a house," he said. "Bison skull and all." "You sure?" I asked. "Sure as shit." He had the hiccups, so Norman handed him a bottle. Gerald eagerly accepted the offer. Together, we followed the trail. Norman checked his shotgun. I checked my pistol. As we rounded the corner, we could see the old wooden house with the bison skull. There was an empty rocking chair out front. We all stopped and stared at it. It was there. It was really there. Norman raised his shotgun. "Come on out," he yelled, "or we're coming in." It was quiet. A couple of seconds passed. Then there was a noise. Something moved inside the house. I turned off the safety on my gun, but kept my finger off the trigger. I'd handled a firearm before, but I also knew in my heart of hearts I was in no condition to use it well. An old man with stripy white hair emerged. We didn't know what to say. It was him. He didn't look a day older. The same high-collar duster, the same revolver. The air turned so quiet I could hear my heart beat out of my chest. "Ain't young men no more," said Gerald. "You still gonna make us sing?" "To me, you're all still very much young men," the old man said. "Seems more than one of y'all lost his mind for you to wander back on my property." Norman wasn't having this conversation. In the corner of my eye, I saw him steadying his shotgun, and before I knew it, he pulled the trigger, turning the old man's head into a cascade of red. But something wasn't right. The body didn't fall over. Instead, it raised its revolver at us. Gerald pushed Norman out of the way and threw himself on the ground. I followed suit. A gunshot rang out, kicking up a dust sprite as it hit the ground between us. The old man had half his head splattered on the wall behind him, but was still standing. Without as much as a change of posture, he walked back into his house and closed his door. I got up off the ground and rushed over to the others. They were okay, at least physically. Norman kept muttering, "What the fuck," under his breath over and over, and Gerald looked like he was having a panic attack. "We gotta keep going," I wheezed. "We gotta keep going." We rushed up to the house. I heard this strange crackling noise, followed by a deep cough. There was a new voice coming from inside. "You boys got me, I'll give you that." Norman and Gerald positioned themselves on the side of the door. Norman pointed at the handle and counted down. Gerald kept shaking his head. As Norman's count hit 0, Gerald opened the door, and Norman stepped up. He took the shot. On the other side of the room was a stranger with a buckshot in his left shoulder, a man in his early 50s. Overweight, with a trucker cap and sizable sideburns. Still wearing that same duster, although he couldn't keep it closed. The place was old and everything was seemingly handmade. No wallpaper, just raw wood. A kitchen with a cast iron stove and neatly stacked firewood. A bed made with straw, knives, saws, hammers, rasps, and files across the wall. No decorations apart from the taxidermied head of a goat on the wall. There was a chunk of flesh and stringy white hair on the floor. "Where's Tom?" Norman asked. "What did you do?" "That how you treat your elders?" The man grinned. Norman clicked his shotgun open and put in 2 new buckshots. The man with the trucker cap was about to raise his revolver, but I managed to kick it out of his hand. He sighed. "There go young men down the Patter Trail," he sing-songed. "That's just how it goes." Norman wasn't playing around. He put another 2 shots in him, painting the wood a blood-stained red. The tools on the wall clinked, and my ears rang from the blast. This time the man stopped moving, but Norman wasn't done. He clicked the shotgun open, loaded another 2 buckshots, and emptied it again. He wasn't happy until this monster was minced meat. Norman sat down panting. Gerald gave him a pat on the shoulder as I looked around. There was a bedroom and a cellar, a little garden out back, and a drying rack. I called Gerald over. "Norman, yell if he moves." "I'll just keep shooting him," he said. "Fair enough." We wandered down into the cellar. The earth was cold. Cold enough for us to see our breaths. What little light we had from above disappeared about 10 steps in, so Gerald used a lighter. He must have stolen it from Norman when he wasn't looking. "Didn't want him to keep smoking," Gerald smirked. I could barely see a thing, but I could tell it was a small room. We could stand upright and there was no echo. We continued forward, only for me to touch something with my foot. I waved Gerald over, and as the light stretched out in front of me, I lost my breath. Heads, floor to ceiling, stacks of heads, young men, old men, middle-aged men, all ages, creeds, and colors. Long hair, short hair, no hair. Dead, severed heads. I'd tapped the lip of a man with fair and well-combed hair, his gray eyes half closed and staring into nothing. Seeing something like that is beyond overwhelming. You know it's going to stay with you for the rest of your life. You know you're not going to forget it. It burns into you and opens some kind of feeling like you've never had before. I just backed away, shaking my head. I just kept saying no over and over and over. I didn't want this in my mind. I didn't want to have to think of this. Gerald grabbed me by the arm and pulled me out of it. We went back upstairs, finding Norman still on the floor with a bottle. The man he'd shot hadn't moved a muscle. Norman looked up at us. "No, Tom?" "I don't know," I said. "I don't know what the hell that was." I sat down trying to calm myself. Gerald started checking drawers and closets. Norman waved his bottle around, giving drunken suggestions. He didn't look away for long. Maybe a couple of seconds. But that's all it took. The dead man inched his hand toward the revolver, and in a snap, he pulled it up and fired, striking Norman in his upper chest. The room erupted. Gerald threw himself on the floor. I hid behind a table. Norman pulled back toward the front door, firing and reloading as fast as he could. Something blew a hole in the table, 2 inches off the top of my head. I could hear boards crack, and something rolled across the floor. Seconds later, there was a new voice coming from the other side of the room. A deep, hateful voice, scornful. Every word had a texture to it, like the ridges of a saw. "There go young men down the pattering trail," it growled, "and I'm going to take their heads." The table was thrown across the room, crashing into the wall on the other side. I looked up to see a man with the head of a goat. He'd taken the trophy off the wall. It wrapped an arm around my neck and pulled me to my feet, pointing a gun at my temple. I didn't stand a chance. It was impossibly strong. I fumbled around with my gun, putting 2 shots in that thing before it ripped it from my hands. I was led outside. Norman had taken cover behind a tree on the other side of the road. Gerald was still inside, hiding. The goat head had this unsettling breath, staggered, like it was trying to keep from getting too excited. "How about you put down that stick of yours, son?" it said. "We could play a little. I might even let some of you go." Norman wasn't about that. Cold steel pressed to my head. "No?" the goat continued. "Then I'll have to play by my lonesome." The revolver rattled to the ground. 2 impossibly strong hands settled on the side of my head, and it began to twist. I didn't have time to scream and cry. It was fast and quiet. Snap. It's hard to explain. You feel this sudden warmth, like your face is basking in the sun. Like you're holding your breath, but instead of panicking, you relax. Little thoughts start to trickle out of you as you begin to forget things. For your eyes to look, for your lungs to breathe, for your heart to tick. And then there's nothing. You don't realize you're not thinking. There's no time, no waiting, no you. But only for a while. My eyes opened. I was picking up my wife's gun. My hands were stained with blood. A goat's head lay discarded on the floor. I spoke, but it wasn't my words. I didn't pick them. "How about now?" I said. "You'll play with me, huh? Or you gonna shoot me too?" Norman was screaming from the other side of the road. Something raised my hand and compelled me to fire a round in his direction. I could feel myself laughing. I could taste old air from someone else's lungs slithering across my tongue. I watched myself turn around to see Gerald. He'd come out of his hiding place. He'd found a lantern, and he still had Norman's lighter. He was going to burn this whole place to the ground. "I suggest you put that down, sir," said Gerald, "and you better do it now." "What, this?" I asked. Then black. I blinked. We were outside. I was panting. There'd been a struggle. I had gunshots across my body. Gerald was pointing my wife's gun at me, but he lowered it as to not shoot me in the head. Norman was flanking with his shotgun, clicking it shut from a fresh reload. He must have been on his last 2 shots. His pockets were turned inside out. "You can kill me 100 different ways, but I'll keep coming," I said. "I'll keep coming, and you're not going anywhere." "This is what's gonna happen," said Gerald. "You're putting him back. We're taking our friend, and then we'll never see each other again." "I don't think so," I said. "Then we'll burn your path to the fucking ground," spat Norman. "Take your pick." "I have another suggestion," I said with a grin. It turned into a blur. Gunshots, screams, blood, fingers turning to claws, raking across flesh, darkness, flashing, gasping. One moment I'm chasing someone across a field, the next I'm being pushed down from behind. I'm frustrated, I'm angry, but it's not really me. Every blink of my eye could be my last, and yet I couldn't panic. It was no longer my heart to beat. "No women!" I screamed. "No children! I'm a good man! An honest man!" I remember having a liquid thrown across my back. Gerald had taken off his coat and lit it on fire. He was running towards me. "Down the patter trail," I screamed. "Down the pattering trail." Then nothing. I think it was longer that time, but it's hard to tell. You don't really count anything or feel anything. There's no clock on the wall. It's nothing. When I opened my eyes, I couldn't move. Everything ached, and I felt a creeping hangover. Norman was looking down on me. "He's up," he said. "Let's go." They carried me on their shoulders, bloody and beaten. Gerald had claw marks across his back. Norman had been shot just beneath the shoulder. It had gone clean through, but it was bleeding pretty bad. And Gerald was carrying a brown paper bag. I don't know how long we walked. Long enough for the sun to lure on the horizon. What happened? I wheezed. I figured if he could take you apart, he could put you back together, said Gerald. He did what? Try not to think about it, said Norman. We're done. We're getting out. Did you get him? No, Norman continued. But we got Tom. Tom had been dead for over 20 years. It didn't matter if that thing could put him back together. He was too far gone. But we got his head, and we could give him a proper burial. Somewhere out in the Texan sands, we put Tom to rest. Gerald tied a cross together with his shoelaces. We took the dry blue sunflowers from Tom's mouth, some kind of preservative, and said our prayers quietly. Even Gerald joined in. It must have been the first time he talked to God in 20 years. When the sun finally rose, we could see familiar streets in the distance. We didn't get our friend back, but we settled a score that night. We took matters into our own hands, and we proved to ourselves that what we'd felt and seen was real, that we weren't just some stupid kids who'd taken a wrong turn. We'd been wronged. Maybe we'll never have proper justice for what's been done, but at least we can find some peace. We took something back from that thing, and if we were to return, we'd bring fire. It knows that, so I don't think we'll meet again. I don't know if this solved anything, but it pulled us back to a place we knew. It put our names back in our phones and gave me faces to remember. And it reminded me again that some bonds never break. I got to come home to my wife with an empty gun. She was just happy that I was okay. Now life goes on, but sometimes when I lay down to sleep, I dream of strange things. Little memories of something from beyond. Little thoughts that aren't mine. Pictures of things to come or things to be. Strange tastes from things I haven't eaten. I suppose that's to be expected. When you've been touched by the devil, he never lets go.